Thank you very much. And what I'll be talking about is getting narration from story-unfriendly mechanics, because I dwell in that world of story punctuated by large amounts of gunplay, and then more little intermittent bits of story in the AAA world of Tom Clancy and other games that focus on mechanics that aren't necessarily what you'd call story-friendly. So, and when I say we're going to make Shakespeare out of this stuff, I largely mean Titus Andronicus. I don't know how many folks here are familiar with that one. It's Shakespeare's play about cannibalism, murder, more cannibalism, more murder, the sorts of things that you generally see more in, say, a video game than you do in a Literature 101 course. But what the heck, it's all Shakespeare, it all plays. So who am I and why am I telling you this? Well, I'm the central Clancy writer for Ubisoft, writer on Splinter Cell Conviction, worked on over 40 video games for Ubisoft over the last 12 years or so. But generally, I'm just a guy who likes writing and thinking about stories and how we can do a better job of getting storytelling and narration into video games. And before we go any further, just a little caveat. I'm a big believer that, yes, we do need to come up with our own vocabulary for this stuff. I believe that what we do as the people who put storytelling into games is really an act of creating the narrative. Everything that we do, the dialogues, the story structures, the characters, everything we put in there, these are narrative elements that the player then takes, and by acting and interacting with them, they make their own stories out of, which they then turn into war stories that they tell their friends. We're all part of the great process. The combination of what we do, what the player does, is what really makes the storytelling. So with that in mind, everything I'm going to say from here on in hews to that standard. I'd also like just to throw out there, what I'm dealing with is, in many cases, is large generalizations. It's very easy to look at any talk that anybody makes, any point anybody makes, and say, well, there's this one independent game I played back in 1993 for 15 minutes, and it wasn't exactly like that, so absolutely everything you're saying is wrong. We probably shouldn't go there. We can always find counterexamples, but this is, by definition, painting with a very broad brush, and it's intended to incite some conversation and maybe looking at those specific counterexamples down the road, but generally just having a good idea, a big idea of where we're going with this sort of notion. So to start with, the idea of getting storytelling from non-storytelling friendly mechanics is kind of a moot point because, well, at a base level, every mechanic, or the most important mechanic, is non-storytelling friendly. What do we do when we play a game on the Xbox? We do this. What is intrinsically story friendly about going like this? Or if you have a Wii, going like this. Or if you have a Kinect, going like this. Not a lot, really. What we do is we are accepting, as game makers and game players, that we are taking these motions and using them and wrapping them in the context of a story to give an experience, to give a player experience, to make it seem like what the player's doing is more than just pressing a button repetitively, or waggling a joystick repetitively, or engaging in poses that are probably going to cause tremendous strain on most people who play games because, well, that's what the Kinect makes you do. But once we move past that, we look at the AAA games, the big titles, and they are largely filled with the sorts of mechanics that are not really what you'd call story-friendly. I mean, what are the sort of things that are story-friendly? You know, conversations with people, reading stuff, learning stuff, lots of ways to get information, to build character, things like that. What do we do in AAA games? We shoot things, right? We blow things up. We drive. We fly. We drive and fly while shooting things that then blow up. But there's not necessarily a lot of story in that, and those things aren't designed to be story-friendly. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. They're a lot of fun. But, you know, that's not to say that we can't necessarily think about getting narrative elements out of these repetitive behaviors that aren't, at first glance, don't seem to be designed for that sort of thing. So, people, as mentioned by James, we're storytelling creatures, right? And we look at these games that we make that are full of exploding zeppelins that, you know, dive bomb dragons and things, whatever else. And we say, you know what, games should have stories, we cram it in regardless. That's one thing we do. And we've all seen games where they're, by God, going to have a story, and it gets put in there, and whether it belongs there or not, and whether it's told well or not, there's going to be a story. We can go the other way and say, you know, this game is really about shooting. So let's get to the shooting, and okay, we have 30 seconds of story, and right, we'll get that out of the way, and now you can go back to blowing things up at your leisure. We can go to separating narrative mechanics, and this is sort of the default solution that we're dealing with these days, where, as James said, you take the narrative, you have it over here, and then you get back to your intermittent shooting of people, and then when that's done, you get back to a little bit of story, and then you get back to shooting people, and that really is sort of the default model that we're largely working with. Or you can try and be really sneaky, assuming you can press the right button, and take advantage of those mechanics, and specifically the ones that don't seem to be really story-friendly, and try and do a little bit more. And try and get narrative elements out of it so that you can get more story from activities that don't seem to be necessarily intrinsically story-friendly. So, a couple things to bear in mind. Scale. Your narrative always needs to be scaled to your game. Narrative for the sake of having narrative is a problem, because one size does not fit all. Mass Effect, wonderful, sprawling space opera, needs a lot of narrative, right? Bulletstorm, you just need to have a reason that you're picking up the gun and blowing the hell out of things, right? So you try and cram a Mass Effect style narrative onto Bulletstorm, probably wouldn't work too well. You try to have that sort of minimalist approach in Mass Effect, probably wouldn't work too well either. Knowing how much narrative you actually want out of the game is key before you start looking at possible solutions and applying techniques. And you also need to think about what really are we talking about when we talk about narrative elements in games. The obvious solution are the wow moments, the big moments, the moments where, for lack of a better way of putting it, things blow up real good. But you know, that's not all there is to narrative. There's more than just the wow moments. There's a lot to be gained from the small moments, from character development, from campaign continuity. One of my eye-opening moments was years ago. I was talking to some students who had played Far Cry, which I'd done work on the script for. And we had 47,000 guys on beaches with guns in Far Cry, and they all needed dialogue. And around 46,322, I got to the point where I had two of these guys talking about how much they liked sand. Because, well, you know, you're on a tropic island and whatever else. And one of them was talking about how much he liked sand, and that's because he grew up in New Jersey, and he would go down to the Jersey Shore. And you know, that was his little spiel, and it didn't mean anything, it didn't have any attachment to larger plot, it was just a little grace note of personality that you get from listening to this guy. And these students ambushed me at E3 from a school in New Jersey, and they said they were playing the game, and they ran into this guy, and they realized they couldn't shoot him, because they knew him. And so they changed their whole gameplay style based on the fact that all of a sudden this little nugget had, you know, given them a personal connection, and all of a sudden here was a story moment that spoke to them. The little moments do matter. So, back to the approaches. Cram it in, because we're going to have story, goddammit, whether we want to or not. There's a lot of problems with this one. One is that narrative gets lost or missed because, well, it gets crammed in and the player's potentially doing other things while the narrative elements are happening. It potentially steps on gameplay. If you have long exposition explaining who you are, what you're doing, and why you need the 7th magical ring of Nurgle, while the player would actually much rather be stabbing orcs, or more to the point, the AI has told the orcs to come up and stab you while the NPC is telling you what's going on. Those key narrative elements are going to get lost, and either the narrative steps on the gameplay steps on the narrative. Player action can wreck it, also known as, oh crap, we shot the villain in the first act, what are we going to do now? And long exposition works against fast action. If we decide we're not going to let the orcs attack, and the player is going to have to sit there and listen to all the stuff about how you get the magic rings, well, what are they doing? They're listening. What are they not doing? Playing. What do we do games to do? What do we pick up games for? Playing. So what this led to was the notion of sort of segregating storytelling and gaming and playing from each other. You know, once upon a time, there was no separation between storytelling and game mechanics because the text was the mechanics. We had adventure games, the story was the game was the story, and we didn't have to worry about building one bothering the other because they were one and the same. Once we started getting pictures, we started getting Great Divide. How many people have played old school adventure games? You know, you got your picture, and then you got your word balloon, and then you typed in something in the text prompt, and then you got another word balloon, you got a picture, and you started getting a little bit of a differentiation between the two of them, particularly once you started getting things like stat screens popping up. And then we got cutscenes. First cutscene, famously Ms. Pac-Man. What the cutscene actually let us do was shove all of the narrative elements, if we wanted to, off and to the side, out of the gameplay entirely. Okay, we're going to tell the story here, we're going to tell it completely over here, and then we can get back to gameplay and you don't need to worry about story anymore. And there's certain advantages to that. You can do things in cutscenes you can't do in gameplay, right? You can apply resources there, you can tell things there, you can have actions there the player's not allowed to do or can't do. You can do storytelling that doesn't get in the way of the action. You know that it's going to be unhurried, you know it's going to take as long as it needs to take, you know that you're not going to have to worry about people missing anything in the game because you're doing this. But on the downside, again, we have a forcible separation, and it created what I call the just have a cutscene mindset, which was anytime you had a story, oh, we'll put it in the cutscene. Well, can we put some dialogue in? So no, just put it in the cutscene. No, just put it in the cutscene. Yeah, no, put it in the cutscene. How many people here have had that conversation? Okay, 1, 2. And we end up with the separation of the wall of text. And this was something that is particularly endemic to the military shooters, games like the ones I've worked on, whereby, to their credit, they took the military idiom that we were working in, created a mission briefing up front, gave you a gigantic wall of text that told you everything you need to know about who you were, where you were, what you were doing, what you were getting, who you were shooting, why you were shooting them, why you were shooting them in that particular location, and possibly, things about their, the enemy's favorite flavor of yogurt and whatnot. Cram that all at you in the absolute beginning so you knew exactly what you were doing when you went to the gameplay, and then turned you loose, and nary a word of narrative happened once you got into the gameplay space. And on a certain level, that's very efficient and very appropriate. Like I said, it works for the military idiom in particular because, well, briefing mission, you come back, you get a debrief, that suits it just fine. But at the same time, it's an absolute separation of narrative elements from this non-narrative mechanic of shooting lots of people in the face. But it's something that we hid behind because, hey, it was very easy and very cheap because text is cheap. You put it up there, you've got all your storytelling out of the way, and you don't have to worry about it interfering with anything else that's going on. Unfortunately, when I say wall of text, I mean wall of text. This is a briefing from one of the Rainbow Six games, Black Arrow. It's one of the shorter ones. And as you can see, well, we're trying to cram a lot of narrative into there, but we're really just having people read something that's very, very, very long. And so it's not very good narrative technique. It's still separated from the story, it's still separated from the mechanics. And as you can see, it's not necessarily an entirely satisfactory solution because, well, we're still trying to evolve past this. And I'd like to point out no actors were harmed in the recording of this mission briefing that was in your thing. But at a base level, this is what we're still doing. If you look at a game like Modern Warfare, they do amazing briefings. They're glorious, they're beautiful. They have technical specs, they have schematics, they have great use of graphics and things like that, but what are they doing? They're still walling off a lot of the narrative from the actual play, right? You get who you are and what you're doing and what the mission is and what you're trying to go after, all that before you go in, before you press button 1, before you fire at enemy 1. And it doesn't matter how gorgeous, how beautiful it is, we're still dealing with the spiritual errors of the wall of text. No mechanics need apply to tell this story. And why is that? Well, it's because we don't get chocolate in our peanut butter or peanut butter in our chocolate. As this demonstrates, chocolate and peanut butter can in fact go pretty well together. That's part of it is the fact that we still are emphasizing mechanics that aren't very story friendly. Shooting, for example, also more shooting, blowing things up, et cetera, et cetera. We don't want narrative to disrupt gameplay because, if gameplay is king, anything that disrupts gameplay is the enemy of what we're trying to achieve here. And potentially, we want to tell more complex stories than mechanics supposedly permit. If you look at our games, how long are they? 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours, whatever. That's a television season. That's space for a really complicated story, and if we have a relatively limited set of interactions, theoretically we don't necessarily have a lot of ways to tell those complicated stories. So in theory, we're better off not trying to tell complicated stories with those mechanics, getting them outside where we can tell the story bit, and then move on and let the play have its own thing. I mean, these are all good reasons. They all work for a certain level, but they don't necessarily satisfy. And yeah, there is the big one at the end there. Separating the narrative elements out, it provides a better narrative control for us, the people who create the narrative. If we take it, we put it in the cutscene or the wall of text, or the modern equivalent wall of text, we control what the player does, we control what the player sees, we make sure they don't miss anything important, we make sure they do what needs to be done, they get all of the narrative, and they can go off and play after that. And control is a useful thing, and for all of us megalomaniacs working in the gaming industry, I think it's very satisfying to have our creations distributed, disseminated to the player in this way, in a way we know they're going to get absolutely everything we intend to give them. But, again, this is all building on the notion of separation, building that the only way to do this, the most effective way to do storytelling in games, is through this absolute separation. And I don't necessarily think that's the case, because ultimately we're underestimating the ability of mechanics to build narrative. And I'm not arguing in the slightest that we deal away with baked narrative elements, that we deal with distinct narrative elements. You get rid of those. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. Obviously, those are very effective tools. We've made a lot of great games. We've had a lot of very interesting stories using all these things. What I'm saying is that they're not the only way. And we can do more to reinforce stories, to build stories, to deepen stories with the mechanical elements of the game if we only take advantage of them and view them not as something separate and distinct from the tools of the storyteller's kit, but rather as something that we can leverage, take advantage of, and use to do some storytelling with. And I think the key to understanding that is realizing that games don't consist of just gameplay or just of narrative. It's the combination of those two that produce a player experience. The narrative provides the context, so your button mashing suddenly becomes smiting robots or smiting orcs or smiting robot orcs or whatever else. The gameplay provides a reason to advance through the story, whatever else. These things work together, you get a synergistic effect, you get the gameplay experience. And out of that, a lot of what we do is context, providing the proper context for the player action, providing the narrative context that makes the player want to move through the space and do the thing the mechanic let them do, and take all of that, combine it, distill it through the player experience to create the fact that somebody has played the game. That being said, how do we take these mechanics, these things like shooting, and try and get something that's story-friendly out of them? Well, the first thing you do is you break it down. You examine what makes up the actual mechanic. I mean, shooting is a simple mechanic, right? You press a button, a bullet or a laser beam or a grenade or an arrow or something goes out, it hits a target, they die messily, right? Pretty simple? Except it's really not that simple. If you're shooting, what are you shooting? What weapon are you shooting? What sort of ammunition are you using? What sort of effects does that have in the world? There's lots and lots and lots of ways that even that very simple mechanic can be broken down, and in the subsystems within it, you can find excuses and ways and tools for building narrative. Once you find those subsystems, those questions, those bits that make up the non-story-friendly mechanic, you tweak them and see if that affects the narrative. And then, of course, profit. So let's take an example. Shooting, like I said, least story-friendly mechanic ever, right? There's no communication between you and what you shoot. Well, there's a little bit of communication. It's very brief, it's very one way, it's very violent. But it doesn't really lend itself to long-term character development or relationships. It objectifies targets of interaction, and it formulates, this is the accumulator mindset. How many people here play Xbox Live or PS3 games, and you get achievements, right? What are those achievements for? Killed 400 guys in 12 seconds. 19 headshots in under 1 minute. Shot person while looking in cigarette case mirror over their shoulder backwards. Not a lot of narrative there. Those, we're talking about counting numbers, right? Okay, maybe it was the shooting's the second least story-friendly mechanic ever. And this notion traditionally fights narrative. I mean, we shoot one guy, yeah, it can be an important guy that you shot. It can be a guy you shot for a reason. It can be a guy you shot by accident. There's stuff that you can get maybe out of one kill, but you shoot a bunch of guys, you're probably not dealing with something that's story-driven. You shoot a gazillion guys, or stabbing them in the case of Dynasty Warriors, and you very quickly have moved out of the realm of narrative because, let's face it, you're racking up kills. And all this reinforces the notion that shooting is a non-story-friendly mechanic. So how do we take this mechanic, this story-unfriendly mechanic, and how do we deconstruct it to figure out how to get some story out of it? Well, like I said, we take it apart, we see what moves. And one of the most important things that is a question of shooting is who you shoot. And who you're allowed to shoot, and who you don't shoot, and when you shoot. Right? It's just a question of when you pull the trigger, right? Except all of a sudden, it raises all sorts of interesting questions that have narrative repercussions. Start with what you shoot. The props matter. The question of which gun you have, that actually brings a lot of character questions with it. The guy who's shooting this is a little different from the guy who's shooting this, right? So ask yourself, and this is one of the places where, as somebody working narrative, you interact with the guys who are doing the weapons design, the guys who are doing the mission design, things like that, and say, okay, what gun is this guy carrying? Why is he carrying that gun? Maybe that's the only one that's available. He's in desperate straits. Okay, that adds a narrative level to what's going on here, because the choice of gun indicates what sort of situation he's in. Maybe it's indicative of character. It's more appropriate for Sam Fisher, super spy who hangs upside down from steam pipes and breaks people's necks, to be carrying a silenced pistol than it is for him to be carrying that thing. It's indicative of character there. And it helps create the signature identity of the individual who's shooting it. And then you start thinking about the secondary effects. When you fire a gun, what do you get? I'll give you a hint. It sounds like this. Bam! Right? So the level of sound that comes out of the weapon, that creates potential story. Is it overheard? Is it not overheard? You have to be very careful in when you use your gun, because you might be overheard firing it. What else do you get when you shoot a gun? You get muzzle flash. How big the muzzle flash is. And this is something that comes out of what size graphic element gets put with it, the illumination, the lighting level, all these things. Well, is that going to get seen? Are you worried about the risk of being seen? All of a sudden, out of the most basic elements of shooting, we have created some narrative moments. We have created some narrative tension. Do I do this? Well, if I do this, these other things might happen. Am I the sort of guy who doesn't care and will blaze away? All these things are built on these simple equations of what happens when I pull the trigger. Next, who you shoot and who you don't. And it's a truism. If the player can shoot, the player wants to shoot, correct? And the player wants to shoot, anything is on the screen is fair game. This includes the villain, the sidekick, the love interest, and the plot. And this leads to all sorts of narrative problems, particularly in trying to build a good villain in video games. One of the reasons I think we don't have a lot of good villains in our video game stories is because the second we put them on screen, the player starts wanting to open up on them with both barrels. And if they open up in both barrels and kill them, well, we're short one villain very early on. If they can't kill them, they get frustrated and don't buy into it. And if we keep the villain off screen so it doesn't get shot, we don't have a lot of good time to develop them as a villain. But the point is, the fact that if you give the player the opportunity to shoot, they're going to want to shoot, and so controlling the opportunity to shoot thus can create some narrative. So what does that come down to? It comes to, in some cases, allowing or denying the ability to shoot. And you control narrative elements by controlling the feature. You establish the reactions and the relationships between the player and everything in the world, including the narrative relationships, by defining interaction. Interacting with the mechanic controls how the player interacts with the narrative elements. Interacting with the mechanic just helps create the narrative. Turn off the ability to fire the reticules over the appropriate target, and you get a massive narrative effect. I know that sounds counterintuitive. It means, hey, I can't shoot, but if you think about it in specific examples, you get some very interesting things coming out of it. So, the benefits of controlling the fire mechanic: you control the target. You keep important characters from getting killed and thus preserve all the narrative you put a lot of hard work into. You reinforce the character by whom the character will or won't shoot. Of course, it can feel a little artificial if you do it wrong, but hey, everything comes with risks, right? So let's take an example. The original Rainbow Six. How many people played that? Okay, we've just gotten the old litmus test for the room. One of the things you could do with the original Rainbow Six, which is about being an elite counter-terror agent, doing hostage rescue around the world, is you could shoot the hostages. You weren't supposed to shoot the hostages. It would end the mission, but you could shoot the hostages. And there's all sorts of narrative implications that come over from the fact that you can, in fact, shoot them, that the reticule isn't disabled when your crosshair moves across an innocent hostage at this point. What do we get? We get that the hostages are fragile. We get that you are an elite and that they trust you to do this, to go in and go into these dangerous situations where you might shoot the good guys by accident, because you're that damn good. And that builds up some character and some narrative. It builds up the fact that there's no margin for error because, well, the hostages are standing very close to the people who took them hostage. And so this is a very tense situation. We're building up narrative tension. And most of all, it gives us the fact that you can screw up. As opposed to the fact that, well, you know, no matter what you do, you can go in, spray and pray, and you're always going to get the bad guys. No, this means that you know, there's a possibility of making a mistake. We've got narrative tension all of a sudden based on what you might do because, well, the reticule stays active when you get over the hostages. Another example, Far Cry 2, there was a big question over whether or not you could shoot animals. And there were a lot of back and forths over this. Implication of shooting animals, if you can, it reinforces the theme that, you know, you are running amok in this African country, and basically, you know, there's a lot of despoiling going on, and so the ability to shoot animals, shoot the wildlife, shoot the natural resources country adds thematically to it. The implications you can't, well, you know, it keeps your implications, it keeps your focus on the human problem. And this was a question that went back and forth a lot during the development. And you can see it play out online. And there's a lot that's going on there just basically over the question of whether or not you could shoot animals in this game. And a third example, Splinter Cell Conviction. The Lincoln Memorial level. How many people played this game? Can some of you please lie and tell me you played it? The Lincoln Memorial level, most of the level actually involves chasing an assassin through a complicated scene that's the aftermath of a political speech, and you're running through all the tents and the media area and everything else, chasing this guy and trying to get him because, well, you're a Sam Fisher super spy and that's what you do. And there are certain limitations put upon you. The assassin, the guy you're trying to get, is a valid target. He's going to be shooting at you. You're shooting at him. Corrupt operatives that you run into in this level, they're valid targets. They're bad guys. You can shoot them. The televisions in the cafe you take refuge in when the bad guys come after you, those are valid targets. You can shoot them. You can shut them up. Police officers, not valid targets. And what does this say? It says that this simple core mechanic helps define your character by saying, okay, even in this desperate moment, even in this, you know, frantic chase, there are limits. There are rules he obeys. He's not going to shoot the cops. He's a good guy. And just the enabling or disabling of the reticule gives us that narrative element about Sam Fisher in this incredibly fast-paced, action-packed moment. And we don't spell it out. We don't say, this makes you a better person because you're not shooting these guys. We just lay the restriction on you, and it's understood as you move through the space and play the game. Something else you can do, alter the mechanic. Player gets used to doing something one way, and if you suddenly change what they're allowed to do, you can combine it with storytelling moment and you get some real power out of it. So again, back to Conviction. We had a combat mechanic called Mark and Execute, which was basically if you did a hand-to-hand kill, you got the ability to mark targets and then you could take them out cinematically without bothering to do anything like, you know, aim. And it was very, very cinematic and very pretty and very cool, and able to really reinforce the spy fantasy, but it was a very well-defined loop. Do the hand-to-hand combat, kill a guy hand-to-hand, then you could do this, then you got the cool reward. About 2/3 of the way through the game, we get Sam's mad moment. He has infiltrated his former agency, which has gone bad. He has learned that his best friend betrayed him. His handler lied to him. They pretended his daughter was dead. They've used him. All sorts of things that really, you know, cast a lot of stress upon a friendship. He's learned that his agency is chock full of treason, and he's kind of mad about this. And what we get is the altered Mark and Execute mechanic. As this sinks in and Sam is enraged and starts working his way out of the building, we get the altered mechanic, the unlimited marks, the unlimited instant effortless kills. It's all reinforced with video and audio. You get a different perspective on the screen. There's music playing in the background. All this is from the simple change to the mechanic, and the mechanics become the expression of character. This has transformed him. What he has learned has made him into an unstoppable killing machine here. The change in mechanics reflects the story reflects the mechanics. We've developed narrative out of a simple change, how many marks you get at a time. Telling stories with systemic AI. Well, most game AI wants to do one thing. What is that? Kill you, right? And it's easy to look at this as a handicap, because, well, they just want to kill you. You can't do a lot of complicated things with that necessarily. But, you know, it's possible to look at this as a source of possibilities, not limitations. And the best example of this, Left 4 Dead, right? Feels cinematic, feels like movies, feels really, really cool, like there's great stories happening in this game. Their director system, it feels cinematic without scripted events, without long talky phrases. And what they did was they took advantage of the context. What do you have with zombies? Do you have enemies that make complicated plans? No. Do you have enemies that give long-winded speeches? No. They have a highly focused, generally understood behavior. Everybody knows what zombies do, right? What do zombies do? Brains, right. And so they play to that strength. They say, okay, the zombies are going to be rushing after you, trying to eat you. Well, we're going to set them up and turn them loose and do it in a way that's going to make it feel like strongly narrative stuff. They took advantage of this core concept of systemic AI to get things that felt narrativistic out of it. A lot of great lessons to be learned there. And hand in hand with that is systemic dialogue. Systemic dialogue is the stuff that you get in games that's there to inform you. So it's like, arg, you shot me, arg, I shot you, arg, he's been shot, arg, I'm running over there so he doesn't shoot me. We're all familiar with this stuff, right? And if we just look at it as a way to inform the players to what's going on, well, it's pretty limited. But if we get creative with it, again, we take this system, that's this relatively dry system, and we can build some narrative from it. If we can get away with multiple dialogue sets that evolve through the game, maybe by character type, maybe by the position in the narrative, then we can do really interesting things with it. We can reference previous action. Hey, this is the same guy who shot up level 2. I remember what you did on level 2 and I'm going to get you for it. I can set up future action. Don't let him get near this other thing. These are variations on, there's a bad guy here. That's really all that we're saying, right? This is just an alert statement. But if you season your alert statements with references to previous or future action, then all of a sudden you've used this system to build a stronger link to the continuity of the narrative. The narrative now lives in these low-level guys as well as in the big named NPCs that have speaking parts. So you get a sense of continuity in the world. You get a sense of the character impact in the world because, hey, even the mooks, even these nameless guys who are walking around the beach talking about how much they love sand are aware of what you did and are talking about what you're going to do next. It's always, you know, good not to overdo it, but there's a possibility there. It's a system that can be taken advantage of to develop more narrative elements. And just to bring it home, another example, Driver San Francisco just came out. Really great game done by the guys up at Ubisoft Reflections in Newcastle. And what is Driver San Francisco about? Let's take a wild guess here. Driving, right? It's not a terribly story-friendly mechanic. It's minimal interaction with characters. It's mostly you and your car, and your car is maybe interacting with other cars. There's the constant possibility of what we call sudden interruption. Yeah, I get a lot of those sudden interruptions when I'm playing. You can ask my wife. Her general comment when I'm playing the game is, that car looks expensive, why don't you go crash it? But let's take a look at the mechanics. Mechanic number 1, driving, right? Well, what are the narrative possibilities of driving? Well, conversations in cars, conversations between cars, even harder to do unless you're in a Herbie movie. Narrative elements from driving activities. Well, there's maybe character consequences from winning or losing or crashing or things like that, but really the act of driving is not terribly narrative friendly. I think we can all agree on that. But driving doesn't happen in a vacuum. Look at all the mechanics. Mechanic 2 is shift. And what it does in this game is it allows the player to move between cars on the fly in essentially real time, and allows for some greater interaction and requires some context. So we go from that car and we shift. Oh look, we're in that car. But it requires context because, well, driving is a realistic behavior, right? Most people here drive? Everybody here agrees driving can be done? Okay, how many people here teleport and take possession of people in other cars on a regular basis? Okay, besides the conference organizers. It's an unrealistic behavior, and we need to come up with some kind of context for this to allow the player to merge it with this realistic behavior and figure out what the heck to do with it. Context is what we need to make them work together. So what's our solution? Well, we put our main character into a coma. We decided that this is all happening inside his head, so all of a sudden anything you want to do is on the board. It's all on the table. The idea is that this is taking place in the subconscious. It gives us a reason for his future. He can do whatever he wants. He's a San Francisco cop, so of course the subconscious world that he falls into while he's in a coma looks like a city map of San Francisco. And it smoothly integrates with all the gameplay. So now we can shift without hesitation or think it's inappropriate. We have a reason for this mechanic to be there. But context also gives us a narrative basis for what we're doing here. He gives us a rationale for the feature, and it lets us start thinking about what we can do with it. We can do new race variants. If you can teleport between cars, yeah. We can do new stunt variants because we can teleport between cars. We can do all sorts of interesting chases and escapes, and we can experience a broader slice of the world by using this thing. And what does the narrative get out of this now that the mechanic feels it has free reign to go? We get all sorts of narrative goodies. We get to be different people and examine different slices of life. We get to try different things, and because it's all in this guy's subconscious, we move towards a narrative climax of integration between what he unconsciously knows and what he consciously knows, how to stop the bad guy. But just saying there's a context doesn't bring us home here. Because we say, okay, he's shifting because he's in a coma, he can do this, he can teleport, we have to have next steps. We're forced to, if we're saying we have this feature, we have to create objectives and goals that utilize shift. And if we're going to do that, we have to create context for the objectives and goals that utilize it. And that means things like populating the world. If you're going to be teleporting into cars and taking over drivers, well, what do we have in those cars? We have drivers. Those drivers have personalities. We want to make the world populated. We want to make it attractive for the player to shift. So he has to be shifting into interesting people and interesting places and having interesting conversations, things like that. The context gives us a reason to have the feature. Once we have the feature, we have a mandate to build the context and build the narrative elements around it. And so we do this, the narrative gets, well, we get character progression. As our character talks to more people, he shifts into more cars, he learns more about himself. He gets to try new things and uncover things that he needs to know about himself. He gets to be a little more experimental because, well, he's being somebody else at the time. And as the character progresses, the uses of shift change a little bit as well. We also get a broader interaction. Like I said, we meet a wider band of NPCs, we interact with them, we produce character depth. Again, narrative stuff that's coming out of just the use of this mechanic. We get the narrative benefiting from a more populated world, from more chances for character interaction development, and more logical linear steps on the way to the climax that is produced by using this one mechanic here. So essentially our functional progression is, we have this feature, we have the shift mechanic, we provide a context for it, we figure out how to use the feature within that context. Because of those uses that we've come up with, we can then ascribe narrative development, get narrative development out of it, and ultimately that comes together to make a great game with awesome reviews. Really, it does. And so, having finished our sort of helter-skelter survey through this, I think I can say safely that narrative possibilities do exist in narrative unfriendly mechanics. They can be unlocked through the examination of the consequences of those mechanics. We can be unlocked through creation of consequences. It can be unlocked through the synthesis of mechanical changes with the narrative elements. It can be unlocked by deconstructing those mechanics, tweaking the bits there, and seeing how they affect the repercussions that follow. And thank you very much for your time and attention. I think it gets back to the earlier slide I did about the scale of narrative that you want in a particular game. I don't necessarily think that using mechanics to develop narrative elements means by necessity adding more or more complicated narratives. I'm looking at it as different ways to express narrative above and beyond just separating it out. Because I feel that if we integrate it more tightly, if you get the elements of the narrative as you're actually playing it, they're more resonant, they feel more connected to what the player is actually doing. And I certainly agree that we don't necessarily want to make these incredibly convoluted David Lynch-esque season 2 of Twin Peaks narratives where you can't tell what's going on without a giant roadmap and possibly large doses of laudanum. Because, well, that's not necessarily what players are there for. Players want to play, and they want the play experience, which I think an understandable, accessible narrative really gives them. The trick is, really, I'm talking about delivery systems, not necessarily complications or amounts. It's a question of how we get it to them as opposed to just wanting to add more.